Hello, everybody. Today is Thursday, July 26th, and we got another Block Digest special edition today with guest Matt Corello. We're going to do a little bit of discussion around the silly idea that Bitcoin developers don't have any incentive to contribute. You want to say hi to everybody, Matt?
Hey, yeah, thanks for.
And then we got the usual cast, Mr. Rick.
Hey everybody, hope y'all are having a good Thursday. It's good to be here with the blue Matt. Not so blue yet, but hey Matt, how you doing today?
Pretty good.
And Miss Janine.
Intrinsically motivated here.
But what does that mean?
Well, if you actually want me to give you a definition, I can pull up one of the papers that I was looking at that Nick was referring to in a tweet that he made. Let me find it really quick. I think I have it. Yeah.
I think you're going to have to. I think we have to be very strict with our definitions, or somebody's going to say that not being paid money out of an ICO is not a good enough incentive.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to find, where is it? Damn. Here. So this is from, I'll mention these later, but just because you asked, intrinsic motivation, this is from a paper called Understanding Motivation and Effort in Free Open Source Software Projects, or that's the title of the section, actually. The title of the paper is Why do Hackers Do What They Do? Understanding Motivation and Effort. And they define intrinsic motivation at the beginning of their paper as the doing of an activity for its inherent satisfaction rather than for some separable consequence. When intrinsically motivated, a person is moved to act for the fun or challenge entailed rather than because of external pressures or rewards. So there's a definition. But to give an intro to the show in general, as Shinobi kind of said, we are going to be talking about the motivations of open source developers, and specifically Bitcoin developers in general, and whether they are different from other projects in terms of the motivation. And the reason we wanted to have this discussion is because, Shinobi, if you can show the tweet from Matt. This was started because a lot of people in the last few weeks or so have been making a lot of assumptions and statements about what motivates Bitcoin developers and how they can, quote, fix it. And Matt was a participant in that discussion, so that's why we wanted to pull him in. And also would recommend, if anyone wants to look further into this topic, Nick Carter recommended that you actually read some of the literature, like some surveys that were conducted with actual developers, asking them why they do what they do. That's important to do when you're going to make statements about what motivates them. You might as well ask some. So, obviously today we're mostly asking Matt. We're going to talk about, what maybe motivates other developers as well. But the first question, I believe, is from Shinobi today.
So I was kind of wondering if you could just break down for the viewers, how did you find out about Bitcoin and what really kind of motivated you to stick around and dig into it?
Yeah. No, I was a student at the time, high school actually, almost college. Saw it on a podcast, and they did a whole technical dive into exactly how it worked, which I wasn't aware of it at the time. It was a podcast I watched regularly anyway. And they went into a ton of, they spent an hour looking at exactly how all of the things structured and all of the details of mining and whatever else. And, I thought it was interesting. I thought it was kind of cool, internet money kind of thing. And so downloaded it, played around with it, got it running, did some mining, and kind of started contributing right away to Bitcoin Core at the time, just because it was not well-written code. So despite me not being a good coder at the time, I could easily contribute. And, I found really nice people who were working on it and were really helpful. And it was just a fun project. It was really interesting.
Okay, so at first it was more just kind of a matter of you just purely found this interesting, and it was something that you were capable of diving into at the time.
Yeah, exactly. It was just super exciting concepts to me. I wasn't I was young. I wasn't super familiar with a lot of the whole cypherpunk culture and, cyberpunk and all the old eGold and eCash design space, and just for some reason found that super interesting. And so kind of just dove head first and kind of been doing it ever since. Obviously as a student, I had the freedom to spend time on it, partially part-time, just kind of, on my free time. And then, these days, it's, if you're a competent developer, finding someone who's willing to pay you to work on Bitcoin, Bitcoin Core, Lightning, a Bitcoin exchange software, Bitcoin wallet for exchange or for people is easy. There's a lot of people pretty desperate to hire in that space. So, once it became an option, as I was graduating college, it kind of became a thing that you could get paid for. There were businesses, legitimate-ish businesses, who were willing to pay a full-time salary for developers in the space. So I was, more than happy to dive into that.
Mm-hmm. And so, obviously, when you talk about motivations for doing something, just psychologically, that can become quite a multifaceted thing if you really dive deep enough into it. Would you say well, obviously you're invested in Bitcoin. How much of that having skin in the game and a financial motivation would you say really contributes?
Almost none for me. And I know that's not necessarily true for everyone, but for me personally, very little. I wasn't materially financially invested until a ways into probably a ways into Blockstream when the price went up a bunch. Obviously I was a student, so I was broke to begin with. I didn't have any money to put into anything, let alone invest. And so, I didn't have material investment in it for a long time until I was full-time employee somewhere, had an income, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm. And would you say in any way there was any kind of political aspect to your personal motivation, or how you would see this kind of playing out in the long term that kind of kept
definitely. I think that was one of my key interests, was always providing financial infrastructure for those who don't otherwise have access to financial infrastructure. So, in the US, that might be a marijuana dealer, that might be, poor and has a lot of problems getting money or getting financial access to the financial infrastructure. That means issues with US exporting financial sanctions and financial policy to people who don't necessarily have anything in the US, don't necessarily have any ties to the US. So I gave a few talks a while back, maybe a year ago now, on kind of financial censorship and how Bitcoin can play a role in that. And a lot of, I guess I wasn't as aware of it at the time I started working on Bitcoin, but kind of as I spent more time on it, spent more time in the community, that became really interesting to me, and kind of providing an alternative for people who have issues with financial censorship or crumbling financial infrastructure like Venezuela or something like that. Definitely became really fascinating to me, and is a lot of why I care about continuing to work on Bitcoin. We can still build this thing that provides real utility for people who need it.
It seems like a lot of the early Bitcoiners sort of come in with an intellectual curiosity, and then you sort of see the possible ramifications of helping out this project, and then just pretty much the landscape of jobs and how you go about getting that and everything. It just the whole free and open source, just go in there and start working it and see what you could do to help it. I see a lot of people come in that way, and it's something where, it seems like, you kind of have to see the whole picture in order to really kind of just take it up and start working with it. Because a lot of people miss one perspective as far as how this could be something that might help people in the future, or they strictly see it as an investment tool, and, they might not be willing to just jump in there full force and help. But that's one of the things that got me in, where it was okay, this thing can do something. How could I help it? And, just as far as the job landscape, it's it's pretty abysmal. And so it's one of those things where, I kind of am a little bit fortunate. I have a little bit of a military pension where I could kind of sit back and do some things to help the network, and just because, I see it as something that we should move forward. So, it's good to hear that, I don't know, it just seems to be a common story I hear from early Bitcoiners.
Yeah, totally. And like, I mean, let's remember back then, you couldn't get a job working on Bitcoin stuff. There weren't all these exchanges who want to hire people. There weren't, people building Bitcoin wallets. It was kind of just a cool hobby that some people did and a bunch of people like mined and whatever. And that's changed a lot. Like Bitcoin has become a very large professional industry. The whole cryptocurrency space has, and there's a ton of really sketchy places that want to hire. And there's some, very legitimate exchanges and mining operations and wallet developers and whatever else. And like, for developers right now in the space, it's, very easy to get that kind of job. But also, businesses, a lot of these exchange businesses have been growing at a clip. A lot of businesses in this space just generally need to grow as general businesses and have all their standard, business folks and all your standard, everything from office manager on up.
I got a question from the chat, Matt. How do you think like your ability and like your motivation to contribute to this space would have been different if you hadn't like landed that initial job at Blockstream and pretty much like found a way to actually be employed in the space kind of early on after you got out of school?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I almost certainly would have, found another full-time job, been doing that full-time, and maybe wouldn't have had as much free time to spend on the space. And I think there's no question that like relying purely on open source contributions where, no one can get paid, where people, people have to get paid somehow. They have to have a job. They have to have some kind of income. And relying on a community where like, no one can get paid a standard full-time salary position to work on this stuff would be problematic, but that's just not the world we're in, right? So like, I find the whole, you showed my tweet earlier, but like the whole discussion started with a few VCs and a few other folks who I'm pretty sure had probably never spoken to a Bitcoin developer, Bitcoin engineer at the protocol level, saying that, obviously all these ICOs are stealing all the developer talent for Bitcoin because they just have so much more money. And that's just completely a joke to me, right? Once it became possible to get a full-time salary position, the concept that like these, Bitcoin lost developer talent because there was no way to make money developing on it is just absurd.
So you would say that like, companies in the space who like by a direct connection to them operating on Bitcoin are an important part of kind of incentivizing contributions to the protocol in general.
Yeah, I mean, no question, right? Somehow you have to be able to make money. And for some people, it's, you can invest in Bitcoin. There's definitely a number of large Bitcoin investors, people who've put a lot of money into Bitcoin and just want to see it succeed, in part because of that, in part because they think Bitcoin's cool, who also fund developers. So it's not just businesses, it's also investors in the space, or hodlers or whatever you want to call them in the space who want to support Bitcoin development. It's also startups. I mean, you look at like Lightning Labs, that's not necessarily a business yet. It's a startup funded to work on protocol development. And you look at Blockstream too. Like if you go read the lead investor of Blockstream seed round, Reid Hoffman, wrote a blog post about why he invested personally in Blockstream at the time the seed round was announced. And I'm not sure that he particularly even discusses the concept of making money. I mean, the entire blog post, the lead investor's entire blog post is about how, Blockstream is about funding protocol development in Bitcoin and furthering that. And so like, that's not, I mean, now Blockstream is much more of a business, and certainly after the A round was, but that's not necessarily where that funding came from.
So kind of right off the bat, like it was like obviously not kind of closing the door on building like a monetizable product, but at first it was just like we need to like get some kind of revenue stream for core protocol development.
More like it was a lot of people who had been working on the space. Yeah, I mean, I think that was definitely a part of it. I guess that was definitely a part of it. And then there was a certain element of like, well, where you have to build a bunch of stuff on top of Bitcoin to make it realistic. I mean, you look at all the sidechains discussion, all of that stemmed from, look, these things don't scale. These things aren't that. It's hard to add features. And so, we're going to have to build things on top. And that was just kind of accepted reality. I mean, going back to 2012, 2011 even, it was just kind of accepted reality that we have to build things on top of Bitcoin to make it have all of the features and all the scalability we want. And so Blockstream was very much like, well, it'd be nice if we could start building some of that. So, pull together a bunch of good protocol engineers, get funding for it, and start building out that stuff and see where it goes. Because, when you're building stuff on top, you inevitably end up finding opportunities to turn some of it into a business, and some of it wouldn't be. That was all fine. It was some of it might turn into a business, and some of it definitely won't. But either way, we have to explore all of it and see what we can build.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I would personally argue, at least among some people, like that was an accepted reality from day one. I mean, like one of the first responses to Satoshi's posting the white paper was discussing account-based money and Chaumian servers on top for an aspect of privacy.
Yep. Yeah, totally. No, I mean, it was very much like this whole on-chain scalability thing was made up by few people much later on. Like it wasn't there from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. All right, and I guess kind of got one more question, I guess, before I pass it off to Janine to go through hers. But we kind of touched a little bit on like political aspects of your motivation, and it seemed mostly concentrated on just kind of providing utility for people who don't have it. Like personally, me, I also kind of want to see the incentives play out as the system grows. And I don't think like a lot of people in Bitcoin that like Bitcoin is just going to completely destroy all forms of government simply by existing. But I do think that just as it gets bigger, it's naturally going to kind of put a stranglehold on ways that government can fund itself and really kind of force it to like cut itself down to the bare minimum. Like, does that kind of attitude in any way like factor into your motivations?
Yeah, I mean, it's not my particular motivation. I know that's a lot of people's motivations. I can't say I'm a huge, I mean, I have my political views. I don't know how much Bitcoin necessarily puts a stranglehold on government at a broad scale, but certainly at the, well, if you fuck up and you end up in a situation like Venezuela, now Bitcoin is going to provide some utility to people so people don't get completely screwed in a case like that. And B, obviously, there's some element of like, you can't fuck up that bad because Bitcoin could, in theory, in the future, provide some kind of backstop against something like that. So definitely, from a like financial services and like the finance aspect of government. So you're like central bank, whatever. The Bitcoin providing a ability to kind of be a backstop against terrible fuck ups is potentially really useful.
Okay, so really not like a core thing, just kind of like an aspect of like building into utility people don't have access to. But
yeah, only as an extension of like helping people if they end up in a bad situation like that.
Mm-hmm. All right, sorry for the slight derailment, Matt, but Chris fucking Ellis, I love you.
Welcome
Where
back.
has your sexy face been?
Oh man,
Dude, I finally completed the proof of work you got me to do by hand. And,
Yes!
so I just need you to verify it. I heard it was really trivial to verify. Very difficult to perform, though.
I'm rich, Chris. Okay, I'm going to give you a very small percentage, but I'm finally rich.
You're welcome. I'm still in the basement that you got me trapped in. I still don't know where I am.
I'll let you out after I verify it.
Dude. What are we talking about today?
We're kind of just, asking Matt a bunch of questions about what motivates him to really contribute to Bitcoin, given a lot of the VCs running around claiming that tokenizing and directly paying devs is, air quote, necessary. So I don't know if you want to kind of just hang out.
So it's kind of like a conversation about intrinsic, extrinsic motivators, open source versus proprietary, for example.
Yeah, there's been a lot of the discussion. There's also been a lot of the discussion in general on Twitter about this. Although I would point out the other argument I was trying to make, at least on Twitter, that I guess I haven't brought up yet here, was around what kind of developers do you want, right? Because you can obviously find developers who are going to follow huge price tag. You're like, okay, we're going to issue this token. It's going to be worth hundreds of millions, and we're going to pay all our developers $10 million a year. If you have these developers who are just going to chase the money like that, look, your token issuance, great. You're going to be able to hire a developer for a year, and then they're going to go somewhere else because the money is better somewhere else. Like, that's not the kind of developers we want building Bitcoin protocol. If you want to build like an exchange like that and hand it off to someone else, fine, whatever. But, you want someone designing Lightning protocol. You want someone designing, SegWit or Schnorr or something like that. These are all things that take a number of years. These are things where you want developers who are in it for the long haul. You don't want that kind of churn. You don't want like new developers coming in every year and all the old ones leaving, because all of that institutionalized knowledge that can be hard to, write down and share, and how people, the experience people have gained from all of the various forks and every little thing that's happened on the network that has given a lot of people experience, you don't want to lose that. And if you're funding through ICOs and you're funding through tokens and you're funding through whatever else, you lose that every year. Because that money just doesn't last.
Yeah. And it sounds like you got the cops after you as well, man.
Yeah, New York City, it's regular enough.
I think one of the observations I'd like to make is that, first of all, we have open source largely because of offset accounting, where developers get salary from another job, they have discretionary spending, and then they opt in to working voluntarily on an open source project, a community-based project. The problem is that that's financed by oftentimes their corporate job. The difference between that model and, let's say, an ICO where they raise way too much money, tens of millions of dollars, is that they set up these foundations and they solicit the money and they say, well, it's got to be sustainable, it's got to have a business case. But then the developers that are working on it are not working on it for the intrinsic motivation. It's not discretionary. They haven't chosen to work on that project. They're working on it because of the money. And that's very different. And when you're in a business, particularly when you're up against other open source companies, open source projects, you're competing with the passion. And sometimes that can be a very difficult aspect of a business to capture, is getting a developer who is intrinsically motivated, who wants to work on that project. We're seeing at the moment, like with that full node Raspberry Blitz, they did a giveaway, when they reached 1,000 followers on Twitter, they gave away this Raspberry Lightning full node. And I thought it was great. And I just joined a company called Shift Crypto in Switzerland, and we're trying to build out, a commercially viable full node package. And I said, well, that's great. We should have done that like that. But that's something I think that you only really get from a community project where they're doing it for the love. They'll work all night. They'll work all day. And I don't think that any of the business models that I've seen so far from this space where, you have a foundation and you raise money and they kind of vote on it. I just think there's this fetish around governance right now where people are just obsessed with rebuilding governance systems on the blockchain for the pure sake of it. And they're not really thinking about the human element of what really gets people out of the bed in the morning or keeps you up at night.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I mean, there's so much of you end up with developers who are focused on shipping or the appearance of shipping, and not developers who are focused on doing it right and, building the right protocol. And that may be okay in more of an application development thing. But when we're talking about underlying protocol for a lot of these tokens and a lot of these blockchains, I just don't think that's the kind of developers you want. You're just going to end up with a product that's not the thing you wanted.
Yeah, I just also what kind of sets Bitcoin apart a lot of times whenever I'm at these meetups and people just are like, well, what are these projects are the same and everything. It's like, yeah, it's like these, I don't know, Bitcoin kind of has just like this myriad of developers where it's like this guy's real adamant about privacy and he's trying to create this thing for it. And this other guy's real, he's like trying to help people because, there needs to be some real censorship resistance here, or there's people in Venezuela trying to help people there because of this. And I don't know, you get all these myriads of people helping because of their passions for it. And a lot of that you do on the other side see, like maybe there's a passion to try and reward a bug bounty or something like that. It's just like not hard. You're not going to find that many people passionate about that project and everything. So yeah, I think like it's kind of sets Bitcoin apart there as far as like what we're doing in some of those other projects. And it's just like some of even like the term open source, a lot of people don't understand it. Like they don't understand like how that's the way that how it exactly produces a product and it's something that moves forward. And a lot of people well, who's in control of this thing and how does it work? And it's like, yeah, it's trying to, explain basically a culture of people that, yeah, maybe they're working a 9 to 5 and then in the evening they come home and they start working on what they're passionate about. So it's hard to explain.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out, because based on the studies that I cited at the beginning of the show, Matt's motivation seems to line up pretty well with what they found in the one study that I was quoting from about what intrinsic motivation is. They say that they found, quote, enjoyment-based intrinsic motivation, namely how a creative person feels when working on a project, is the strongest and most pervasive driver. We also find that user need intellectual stimulation derived from writing code and improving programming skills are top motivators for project participation. That was from a study way back in 2003, so it might be a bit outdated. And my questions will have to relate to whether, because none of these studies except for one, which is titled Carrots and Rainbows, has been written in a time when Bitcoin even existed that I could find. And the Carrots and Rainbows study said that they point out that some developers are unpaid volunteers who seek to solve their own technical problems while others create open source software as part of their employment contract. And they said that asking, inquiring about what the motivations are for open source developers would expand our assumptions about individual motivation to include the idea of a long-term value-informed quest beyond short-term rewards. So, my question for you, Matt, is do you think that Bitcoin, being the fact that it is not only an open source project, but also, a scarce digital money, do you think that significantly distinguishes it from other open source projects, especially in terms of like the funding aspect?
I mean, obviously it distinguishes it just from the types of people who are attracted to it, right? When we're talking about open source and people being interested in building the project, while, it being, people are attracted to Bitcoin as its utility exists, whatever you think its utility is. Everyone has their own view of, what Bitcoin can provide. As for funding, I mean, it plays a role to some extent, right? Like Bitcoin being this thing that is shared and has a large industry built directly on top of it, right? I mean, you compare this to Linux is maybe kind of similar, but you don't say, oh, we're I mean, there are some, but relatively few. We're like a Linux company, right? So you have well, I mean, I guess you have that, right? So like I guess it's similar in the sense that the Bitcoin as a existence of an asset, an existence of this thing, has allowed it to have this industry built on top much faster than a lot of other projects. And so it has quickly gotten to the point of where you can compare it to something like Linux or Hadoop or, one of these large tech stacks on which there are actual full companies built who are providing services on top of this. Well, so same with Bitcoin. You have all of these exchanges, you have wallet providers, you have people doing various, consumer level development, whether it's, consumer level full node or encouraging people to, Bitcoin ATMs. There's a ton of like boutique market making in the Bitcoin space. And I think so, like just Bitcoin, because of the unique structure of what Bitcoin is, just has allowed it to grow really fast. But I don't think it's materially different in terms of how developers get, funded and paid at the open source level. You look at a number of other open source projects, and it's pretty similar, right? There's people who are in one way or another making money from the project or have their business built on the project, and they rely on the project, fund developers and fund people to work on it. And it's the same thing with exchanges. I mean, you look at Coinbase trying to hire they want to hire 5 people, I think, to contribute to open source projects in the space, just to give back, and because they want in-house knowledge. They want people who understand Bitcoin Core internals, understand parity, full node internals, blah, 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 so that they have that kind of knowledge in-house and they can, ask them questions when they want. And so you see a similar thing developing. That's exactly what Red Hat's model is. It's exactly what a number of these other companies' model is. And so I think it ends up just being very, very analogous.
Yeah, and my second question would be, like, considering how quickly Bitcoin has been, what I would consider successful, especially in this area where a lot of the developers have found some way to support themselves, whether through companies that are willing to pay for that development, or just because they work on it and they own Bitcoin, and what they contribute to Bitcoin makes it more valuable, and so they get paid in a sense in that way. Why do you think there's so many people that have this impression, or at least are telling other people that they think the incentive structure is broken?
So there's 2 things here. I think obviously people look at all the money going into these ICOs, and there's this fallacy that I've seen a number of VCs perpetuate and various investor folks perpetuate. That's like, oh, these guys have raised X dollars X millions of dollars. Clearly, they're going to be able to hire good developers, and they're going to ship a competent product. And I think we've seen repeatedly in the space that that's just not how that works. Like, competent developers don't grow on trees, and you look at the competent companies in the tech space, and they know that, right? You go to a recruiting pitch for Google, go to a pitch where they're trying to hire students out of college and see what they say. And I guarantee you, it's not money, money, money. It's not, we're going to pay you $10 million. Every word out of the recruiter's mouth is work on cool shit that matters. Work on stuff that you have millions of users, you have billions of users, work on stuff like work on hard, interesting problems, work on all these scale problems with all these servers. They're not sitting there saying, like, we're going to pay you millions. And in fact, they do pay well. They pay better than, a lot of open source jobs. They pay better than a lot of startup jobs. And so they could be making that pitch, but they're not, for a reason. And so, it's weird to me that this fallacy has developed, because, it seems like everyone in the tech space who has invested, the number of internal studies on how to do better recruiting and how to retain engineers and how to whatever at Google and at Microsoft and at all these places is huge. Like, they hire people to research how to hire other people. And their conclusion is the exact opposite of all of these VCs talking about, like, oh, well, if you raise $100 million, you're going to be able to hire a bunch of really good developers.
Yeah, and that brings me to my last question before I pass off to Rick, which is, like Chris mentioned, a lot of these other cryptocurrencies are basically being built around these foundations, which are supposedly, avenues to, like, manage and make funding easier for developers who want to work on that cryptocurrency. For example, Zcash has the founder's reward that's split up between various individuals and also to a foundation. Do you have any opinion on whether you think that's a better model, or does that create more problems in terms of the incentive structure for the cryptocurrency itself?
There's definitely room for making sure people know how to get funding for their projects in the space, right? I readily admit that that's a problem in Bitcoin. There's a lot of developers who show up. There's a lot of people who don't know that you can get funding to work on various things in the Bitcoin space. more recently, it's been, things have been more vocal with like Coinbase announcing that they're trying to hire people, and several other companies have done kind of similar things. But a lot of it's also not public, right? There's a few companies in New York that I'm aware of who want to hire for similar roles. They just want to hire someone who contributes to open source in the space, and then when they have questions, they have someone sitting in their office they can ask questions to. There's a number of companies who would readily hire for a job like that, not to mention various hodlers and various investors and various people who are just willing to fund a developer who sits on the other side of the globe just to give back. So there's a difference here in just like the availability and visibility of the available money in the space. But at the same time, all of these foundations, I mean, you have to have people who are excited about the project to begin with, right? A lot of these, I think the foundation only helps with, yes, if you need money, we can help provide that. We can help give grants, whatever, but you have to already have people who are interested in getting those grants. And we've also seen various issues with the way these foundations end up actually giving the grants. There's been various dramas and various cryptocurrencies about how people get grants and being dissatisfied with those programs. So, obviously that creates its own challenges. And then finally, I'll draw back to what Rick said earlier what Chris said earlier about, just this weird fetishization of governance in the space right now. And it seemed like there is a willful ignorance of, Bitcoin as this is freely governed. There's no, central committee making decisions for the future of the cryptocurrency, and very deliberately so. Whereas a lot of other kind of newer groups, don't have that model. They create these foundations specifically with the goal of governing the cryptocurrency, or at least kind of providing a central authority. Even if they like to say, no, we don't make decisions about consensus rules, at the end of the day, they kind of end up being a central authority for the system. And then also, because of that, kind of refusing to see Bitcoin differently. And so I think there's definitely some aspect of the reason some of this conversation started with some of these folks on Twitter was that they've just been seeing all of these cryptocurrencies running around saying like, yeah, no, so we have this foundation to do governance, and that's really important. And, it's a whole lot better than Bitcoin Core, which currently governs Bitcoin, and Bitcoin Core is this opaque thing. But instead we have this like open and transparent foundation. And of course, that's just not reality of how Bitcoin is governed. But there is a like deliberate desire to not see Bitcoin in that way. And so you end up with this like invalid comparison of this foundation that's governing a cryptocurrency and Bitcoin Core, where like Bitcoin is infinitely larger than Bitcoin Core, but of course for a lot of these cryptocurrencies, they're no larger than their foundation.
Yeah, and before I pass off to Rick, I wanted, because I specifically mentioned Zcash, and I would also give an example for Ethereum. For Zcash, they had that controversy recently before the ZCon conference where I believe it was the lead maintainer of some of their GUI wallets, at least for Windows, was stirred up this controversy about the fact that they weren't getting paid, and they ended up getting paid because something about they were threatening to participate in a fork or to stop working on that maintenance if they didn't get paid. And they eventually did by an anonymous contributor. But I think, that's an example of where the funding failed in Zcash. And an example in Ethereum was, I would say, the MyEtherWallet thing that happened, where the company split into MyEtherWallet and MyCrypto. And one of the things that I believe her name was Taylor Monahan, she kept mentioning was the fact that they just didn't have enough money, and she was very stressed. And so I have no doubt that probably contributed to the split that ended up happening between those two companies. And it just really blew my mind, because basically every person in Ethereum you would ask, they would say MyEtherWallet is the wallet. Like, that's the wallet that they recommend for people to use, unless you actually like know how to just, put everything together yourself as a developer. So again, another instance where you have these foundations that are supposedly set up to make funding development easier or managing it, and yet they have these really big failures for core infrastructure.
Yep, totally.
But yeah, like I just wanted to get into a few topics and some of that stuff about basically like, you know, that news was kind of breaking from GitHub as far as like what was going on there with Zcash, and, you know, it's kind of backdoor discussions there. Well, I would call it backdoor because I'm mainly on Twitter and like some other places. So, but we sometimes find those discussions and we bring them out and we try to, you know, talk about it here and everything. And so I was going to see like, you know, do you think that's, you know, is that being done? Like, is there some more discussion that's going on at GitHub that we should be talking about more on Twitter? Or is that like, it's a good thing that the development discussions we're maintaining in like this, this development area where, you know, people that aren't really developing are getting in there that much? Or, you know, should these things be brought out more into a public discussion, or is it kind of good the way things are going right now as far as discussions?
I think it's important to separate things out, right? There's discussions about individual projects, right? So like Bitcoin Core, obviously, 99% of the work has nothing to do with consensus. It only affects users of Bitcoin Core, and only then because it's like a performance optimization or a new feature or something. And, you know, if people don't care about that, there's no reason they should need to discuss it. Like, you know, there's new performance optimizations. That's cool, that's important, but it's not exactly critical for the whole community to be involved in a discussion about that, or a discussion about some new feature to the wallet in Bitcoin Core. Then there's protocol level discussions. And with those, I mean, you know, there's obviously already a lot more visibility, right? Anytime there's a BIP about a potential soft fork, that hits Twitter, that hits Reddit, and there ends up being a broad discussion. So I'm really happy with the way that works in the Bitcoin community. Certainly, you know, when something affects other people, or at least when something affects all Bitcoin users, like any consensus change will, then there's very broad discussion of it. Whereas when it just affects users of Bitcoin Core, users of the Bitcoin Core wallet, or users of the Bitcoin Core GUI wallet, then that's more on GitHub, and, you know, that's on those users to participate if they care. Or, I mean, if it's just like there's new features, they don't have to use it. They can ignore it. It doesn't really get in their way at all, right?
Yeah, I mean, like I'm with you on that. It does kind of help serve a purpose of where it's like only important enough and pertinent enough information is kind of breaking through. I'm kind of enjoying that. But I mean, like one of the things we've kind of seen recently in the space was like, you know, Slack got some investors where people started, you know, moving away from Slack, and, you know, because just a fear, I guess, of like information, you know, being sold out and everything like that. And recently we've seen Microsoft purchase GitHub. Like, I was wondering like how you feel about that. Is that something that the community should be thinking about when this repo is like, you know, kind of just sitting in Microsoft's hands, or in these discussions and such like that? Or is it like, is that something we should be thinking about where maybe there should be like a movement of that repo, or just like, I mean, does that sit well with you?
You know, movement has a lot of overhead. And I don't think it makes sense to take on that kind of overhead unless there's a clear reason to. And I think there's various ideas people have about, you know, it would be nice if it weren't, but at the same time, the fact is, you know, I mean, unless Microsoft starts putting stuff on there and like actually censoring people, at which point we would obviously be happy to move an hour later, right? Like, we would very quickly move. And so as long as they don't violate that trust, I don't see a huge reason to kind of take on that overhead and go deploy something else and whatever else. And obviously also, you know, the repo is not just on GitHub, it's also signed by all of the maintainers. So there's a number of scripts to verify that all the signatures are there and all those are in the right place. And then of course, various people, GitHub has a really good API, and there's various people who have full mirrors of every comment in the Bitcoin Core repo, at least that they've downloaded locally, so they can share that if they wanted to. You know, it's not something that generally is worried about, I don't think.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that I think, like we were saying, like there's a lot of governance discussion in there, and like, you know, sometimes these big companies come in there and it's just like, oh, well, this is, you know, some problem for Bitcoin governance. But I think whenever you do start looking at the amount of information and the different ways that it can be just sort of duplicated and put somewhere else, then, you know, it's not too much of a worry. But
exactly. And Bitcoin governance isn't about Bitcoin Core either. So, you know.
But Matt, didn't you know that Microsoft is the devil?
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main reasons why people get a little worried on that. So let me ask you a quick question from the Mumble. I was asking the guys in the Mumble earlier if they had some questions for you, and got Sir Meow was asking if you see Rust Lightning as a solid long-term project or just an experiment.
I don't know yet. Obviously, a bunch of work has gone into it. It's actually a usable client now. You can open and close a channel. You can send and receive a payment. It doesn't store things on disk, so if your node ever crashes, you lose all your money. Sorry about that. But it, there's been some interest in contributing. I think it's a question of, is it actually filling a niche? It is structured in a pretty different way. It's much more of a library than other existing Lightning clients. It's possible that doesn't fill a niche, but it's also possible that some people who have existing wallet products might find an easier time integrating that versus some other Lightning node. I think it's all a question about, is there user interest? There's a number of contributors now. I was talking to a guy who wants to use it actually as training for some of his developers. He's hired a bunch of people and wants to actually just have them learn Bitcoin by contributing to Rust Lightning, and multiple full-time people for a few months. That's a lot of developer resources behind it potentially, and so it's just kind of a question of do people want to use it? Because if people want to use it, I'm happy to make sure that it ends up becoming a much more full-featured, usable Lightning library. Whereas if there's no interest in it, then cool, I learned Rust and I built this cool thing, and I'll move on and then work more on BetterHash and whatever else.
Yeah, it seems like there's just so many projects moving forward with Lightning, like we were saying earlier, as far as just where the development's going in the second layer. And there was another question about some other developments in Lightning. What were your thoughts on P2Pool and Lightning Network Braid Pool idea?
The Braid stuff on building a new P2 pool is cool. Obviously, I'm really interested in anything that can help potentially decentralize hash rate. That's all of the motivation for BetterHash. And so, if anyone actually has the time to build something like that and can make it happen, that'd be really awesome. It is a lot more complicated than BetterHash. It is, P2 pool was already complicated to get off the ground and had usability issues, and some of it was just kind of user experience issues, less protocol level issues, but had issues that resulted in people not using it. And so getting something like that built is a lot of effort. But if someone actually manages to do it, that would be really awesome. And then get adoption, right? I don't think anything that is going to help mining decentralization and help distribute the choice that miners have in selecting transactions and improve future mining decentralization and censorship resistance, I'm all for. So.
Yeah, I think, just like the amount of developments on Lightning, like we were just saying, it's going to be interesting. And if we can improve P2Pool and BetterHash and all that, that's great. Yeah, I'm excited to watch all those. So I was curious about your ideas about as further Lightning development. I'm starting to hear a lot about, like you're saying, just sort of people working strictly in Lightning and trying to get that whole process moving. How do you see that Lightning network develop, taking off? Is it good in your eyes? And just a follow-up finishing question, how come Bcash is struggling to find these developers?
I think the Lightning community has done a really good job of attracting application developers and people interested in using this. It's kind of the instant payment thing has always been a major blocker for Bitcoin adoption for some applications like that, I think. You obviously saw all of the Satoshi Dice and a lot of the early kind of Bitcoin applications try to work around that and try to use, some of them try to use ZeroConf or try to use various other things to develop this kind of instant feel to the application, even though it never really was. But the Lightning community is kind of really delivering on solving that problem. And for a lot of applications that, even if it's just small value stuff right now, it obviously has very low payment limits and low channel limits. Even if it's just small value, that solves a lot of problems for some developers and gets a lot of people really excited. And so I guess that also answers your question about why Bcash hasn't gotten any of that. It's like
I was thinking,
they don't have instant
answering-
payments, right?
You're
I mean, they
answering it as
didn't
you go.
provide that one major feature that has made a big difference to a lot of developers.
Big point.
Yeah, Shinobi, if you want to show, I can't pronounce his first name, but Deedlenix, is that how you pronounce his handle? He actually just
said Deadalmix.
Deedlenix.
That's
So
what I say.
he just tweeted about 45 minutes or ago that Craig Wright has blocked him. So yeah, that's I always, you know, that kind of situation doesn't happen often where you just have a development team completely split into like 3 different groups. Because I mean, as far as I know, Deedlenix is like the main developer working on Bitcoin Cash. So the fact that Craig Wright is like, you know, there's apparently rumors that Jihan Wu is going to go his own way, Craig Wright's going to go his own way, and maybe now there's going to be a 3-way split. So that's quite interesting. But it doesn't really surprise me because I don't feel like there's as much of there's really not any support for developers who want to work on Bitcoin Cash that I can see.
I mean, there's like funding. I guess back to the earlier topic, right? There's funding for people who work on Bitcoin Cash. Like Craig Wright has raised a lot of money, and so nChain has been paying developers pretty aggressively. There's the Bitcoin Cash Fund, which is, you know, a big Bitmain, and I think Roger both publicly said they put a lot of money into it. So there's a lot of funding for it, but there's not a lot of vision. There's not a lot of excitement about, you know, what to do next there. And so you look at like the Bitcoin Cash ecosystem grew out of a protest vote. And once you're no longer protesting, once you're like, okay, we're now an alternative, we're like a freestanding thing, you're no longer a protest vote, you don't have a vision. So like you end up with this split where there's just people who have different views of what it should become, right?
Yeah, I think it's degenerated to booth babes and dancing badgers at this point. It's not that great. So yeah, it's they're lacking that intrinsic, and it's definitely something where you start. I explain to people it's such a delicate incentive structure in Bitcoin, and you start tinkering with that, and you might have all these problems split off down the end. So yeah, I think that whole foundation and just central funding idea does lead to all those problems. So Chris, it's going to jump you back in the conversation, man. I think that finished me up for the questions that had you in. So I want to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good stuff I've been hearing, and I've been thinking and taking notes as I've been listening to you guys talk about it. I think that we need to stop using open source as a marketing gimmick. People need to see it as more than just something that is like a value add on top of their product range and something they can boast about. I think it really is about the motivation of what's really driving us. I think from the open source community side, having been involved in a lot of the community activism, open source projects in the past, I think there also needs to be an honest recognition, sort of a candid recognition from us that open source exists as a product of corporate industry, right? It's kind of like, I liken it to like the stinging nettles, right? You see stinging nettles because there's a rich amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil. And so the stinging nettle really just becomes a signal in the environment that there's something else in the environment that's giving rise to it. And that doesn't make us parasites. I don't think we should see it that way. If anything, we're the opposite of a parasite, because even though we're an offshoot of this corporate world that generates all this surplus wealth, in fact, that's actually what it's really good at. Think about Apple, Google. I mean, what do they do really well? They create large stores of capital. And the fact that you get all these overpaid developers that then go off and, as I say, with their discretionary spending power, decide, actually, I'm going to put my time and energy into something that I really care about, that's actually something really about putting something back into the ecosystem. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be cautious with it, because like we saw with the Heartbleed and the OpenSSL and issues like this, there has to be some accountability. And when you're being paid, there's a contract of employment, and there are clear, chains of command and accountability when things go wrong. The problem, I think, that open source has, particularly with Bitcoin, is that if the developers fuck up on most open source community projects, oh, well, nobody's paying them and you can't really go and complain. But if it's like with Bitcoin, that's people's money. So there is something on the line there. I can see why, like, for example, Congress in the US, I think, had a hearing about this. And one of the concerns that was raised was what do you do when industry and millions of consumers are reliant on open source community projects where there is no line of accountability? But I think what open source as a culture, as a kind of an innovation of human resource management, I think is really what it is. I think what it does is it finds areas of innovation that companies can't, because companies are not incented to build certain industries, and they're not incented to build certain types of product. I think you can only really do that where there's a passion. And so that's what I'd really want to focus on. The other thing I was thinking about was the concept of a constitutional convention, because we were talking about governance and the fetishization of governance in the model. And so the constitutional convention, or a constitutional event in history, is when a group of people come together and they reevaluate the laws and customs that they've been living by. It's, a friend of mine said to me yesterday that laws are preceded by rights. And that is to say that laws really are a recognition of what is inherently true about humans' natural rights. So when we write laws, we should not consider laws to be literature. It's not just that we write this thing. The laws, in order to be meaningful, have to be enforced. There has to be a regularity and a predictability to that enforcement. Because if they're enforced arbitrarily, or you feel that there's a political motivation standing behind the enforcement of those laws, then it's not really law anymore. It's just literature, right? They're just edicts. And so certain laws apply to certain people and others don't. What I really loved about Bitcoin when I first learned about it was that you enter the system, and by opening the software and by choosing to run the code, you've opted into a social convention. You've opted into your own constitutional convention, right? Because you're now saying, I am bound by these laws, and my consent is implicit in my opening of the software, my choosing to run it, my ongoing commitment to run the software. And everyone is forced and bound by those consensus rules, by what we now call the Nakamoto consensus. And I just really loved it because money is an incredibly important thing in our lives. And if we don't have a lot of say over it, we just outsource all of that. If we just give that to the banks to deal with, or like when we vote, voting doesn't even mean what it really means. I mean, democracy has lost its meaning, right? Demos kratos. I mean, talk about people power, which is what the etymology is in Greek. We don't really have any power anymore. We're just outsourcing our decision making to a group of politicians who are notoriously corrupt and have been proven time and time again to be so. And then we just say, well, let's leave this guy in power for 5 years and let him make a whole bunch of decisions. Whereas Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general, I've said it many times, the most important feature that Satoshi Nakamoto included was the open source license. Because he could have made it proprietary, he could have made an absolute fortune out of it. But he chose to make it open source. And even though it has given rise to this money printing, we are going through this phase of, because people kind of realize that money's only really scarce, if you're not close to the source of supply. So if I just create my own supply and create this belief that my shitcoin is valuable, then I can kind of get rich for a while. And my hope is that eventually we'll kind of get tired of that, and eventually that will just fade away and we'll move on to more mature things, I hope. But I can't say for sure. So those are the kind of thoughts. And then finally, I was thinking what Matt was saying about the usability rather than the protocol layer. And that's something I think about a lot. It's really important because Kirchhoff's sixth principle is that if the system isn't usable, then it's not secure, because people simply won't use it properly. And therefore, if you're building a security system, you're building like a cryptocurrency wallet, for example, and you make it so damn difficult to use that you don't end up with good end user compliance, then it's effectively not secure. And one of the things I've been worried about as I've been going through some of the products in the cryptocurrency ecosystem, particularly with the open source community, is you find that it's very heavy on the engineering side, and they're very good at building technically proficient tools like Electrum, which is a hacker's wallet. But they don't necessarily build for the human. They don't necessarily build for the teacher or the plumber or the people that have divergent interests and focuses and concerns. So when it comes to participatory governance models, I like the fact that Bitcoin allows anyone to be involved. The only thing that really stops you is your will to do so, and your enthusiasm for it. I think people are still in this kind of mindset in the general public that these big economic shocks are just too big. It's just a numbing effect on them. The same with the hacks that have happened in the space. Something big and amorphous happens, and there's just this numbing response from the public, where it's like, well, I can't do anything. What can I do? I'm just one guy. And it's really encouraging people to think more autonomously, more confidently, more independently, to get involved, because, like I say, the only thing that really stops them is their own will to do so. They have to really want this if they want to change it. And I think that's why Bitcoin Cash hasn't succeeded, because it was a constitutional event that grew out of conflict. And so all the people that were there had an appetite for conflict, whereas all the people in the Bitcoin Core and the UASF, that was something about keeping us together, I felt. So that was kind of where it went wrong. Sorry, I didn't have any questions. I should have, but you said a lot already, so I didn't have any questions. So just thoughts that you've given me.
Yeah. No, and I agree, and I really like your phrasing of describing the consensus rules as kind of this opt-in constitution that you agree to explicitly when you become a Bitcoin user, and then I really like the phrasing of that, because it really hammers home this, like, the consensus rules are something special, and, like, whatever gets changed in Bitcoin Core, whatever gets changed in any other client in Bitcoin, whatever wallet you use, even if you're just using an exchange, if you're just using Coinbase, at the end of the day, these consensus rules are the things that bind the definition of Bitcoin. They are what defines Bitcoin itself. And so, as we talk about changing consensus rules, what implications that has, and how we think about consensus changes, and how we think about, what is required from the community for consensus changes to happen. It's all about these kind of constitutional events, and this kind of concept of it being a constitutional convention to make any change to these consensus rules. And, obviously, I think a lot of them historically have been completely unobjectionable. And, there's nothing wrong with changing a constitution if everyone just looks at the change and is like, yeah, okay, that seems fine. That's a simple clarification, whatever. But that, we have to keep in mind that this is ultimately something which we need to ensure as a community. It is difficult to change, and that when there are changes proposed which create winners and losers, well, we shouldn't look at that and weigh the winners and losers. We should look at that and say, is this a change to the Constitution that is acceptable to all of the people who've all individually opted into this? And are we taking something away from someone?
Yeah, I did actually have a thought and a question actually to Matt, which was really the impact that the internet has. I guess from about Linux onwards, we saw this dramatic change in asynchronous cooperation across borders, right? You saw large groups of mostly engineers. And I wonder what effect that has on the border. I mean, the nation-state border, and how it erodes and how it becomes more like a boundary rather than a fixed border that we're used to thinking of, like patrolled with guards with weapons and guns and so on. But the internet has kind of made the border almost a non sequitur. Like it's still there and it has a place, but it's losing its relevance now. If we can just do everything or many things over the internet, like we can create a whole global currency, as we've seen in the last 8 years, without the need to physically cross a border. And that level of cooperation that so many companies find difficult to get right when they have distributed teams all over the world. And so I wondered if you had any kind of thoughts on that.
It's interesting that, the internet has created a global nation, essentially. And it has been interesting, especially, from the Bitcoin point of view, to watch governments export their laws across their borders where they can using technology. You look at financial censorship globally, and it's a question of largely the US. Largely, it's a question of the US Treasury deciding this person in Iraq is somehow funding terrorism, we think, and thus we're going to make sure that they're not allowed to get a bank account in Malaysia. And it's weird because it's technology has enabled them to do that, and at the same time, it's enabled, this kind of cypherpunk mentality of we can, do something across a border where governments can only enforce the law on the people within their country and only do so in meat space, but not necessarily online.
Yeah, but the American government is, essentially the American Constitution was based on the Roman Empire, which was the first empire that we know of that was built without borders, right? It was a borderless empire. And if something doesn't have borders, it doesn't have a shape. And if it doesn't have a shape, then it can take whatever form it wants, depending on the will, right? It can turn up and it can say, okay, like the DOJ, right? The Department of Justice, exports. It's a global brand. I mean, the FBI, which is a department, which is a subsection of the DOJ, is a global brand. I mean, we see it in the movies. You export your movies all over the world. I don't mean to personalize you in that statement, but I mean you as in America, right? So the American culture, I don't really remember any times in history where the US has successfully invaded and occupied another country, but it does very well at exporting its culture through its ideas, through its music, through its entertainment, and now I guess through its engineering. But I wonder, like with this export, I've heard it be said in our industry, I won't name names, but it has been said by a group of people in this industry that we're pretty much entering an era now where everyone else that isn't in the US or Russia has to pick a side. Like if you're in Switzerland, you're in Germany, you're in Netherlands, pick a team. You're either under the control of the United States or you're in Russia, and you can't have it. You've got to just pick one, because the US and particularly the law enforcement.
It's a very Cold War view. There's also China,
isn't it? Yeah, that's what I was thinking. But I've heard, the reason I'm concerned about it is because particularly post Dodd-Frank and all of these rules. You talked about the porn a little bit before I came on. The people that produce porn are now finding their accounts being shut down. And I've asked, personalities like David Birch. He didn't make the Russia comment, by the way. That was somebody else. But David Birch, has this view of the cashless society, which my view is just it's a euphemism for mass surveillance. And this idea of changing the status quo, taking a concept like cash that we had before that was inherently anonymous by its very nature. You had the privacy through the anonymity property of cash. And then to digitize it and to make the absolute design decision to build mass surveillance into that model, rather than looking at the offline analog and saying, actually, we want to mimic many of the properties that cash has given us. I find it foreboding. It's almost like, did the guy read 1984 and was he turned on by it? Did he think that, hey, this is a good idea? Why don't we institute? Did he read Mussolini? I mean, Mussolini wrote this essay, and I have read it to him before, The Doctrine of Fascism. I don't think he wrote the whole thing, but it was one of the things. And I read to him the line, at the end where he says, state intervention, I'm quoting Mussolini now, 1935, Fascism, Doctrine of Institutions. He says, state intervention in economic production arises only when private initiative is lacking or insufficient, or when the political interests of state are involved. The intervention may take the form of control, assistance, or direct management. And I'm thinking, hey, did you just go read this thing and get all this inspiration and thought, wow, this is a good idea? I guess now that we've got all these cameras and these CCTVs, which don't work, by the way, and we've got all this surveillance tech, we should just really, really apply it. I just feel like, do they think that this group of people who want to build this mass surveillance society across the world, it's a nation without borders, the United States. Do they think that all these pornographers and all these drug dealers, this big shadow economy, they're just going to moralize? Like, what are they going to do? Get respectable office jobs? I mean, they are consumers too. And you've got to think about the externalities of what this really means. If you suddenly start surveilling people, people are going to behave differently. People behave differently when they feel like they're being watched. Jeremy Bentham, you don't even have to be watched in order to change someone's behavior. You just have to give them the feeling that they are being watched, and it will change their behavior. And I don't think we're thinking about the negative externalities of that. I think it's an example of where ethics, particularly bad ethics, have creeped into the engineering process, and managers have designed a digital, cash, because digital cash has existed, I guess since the 70s or maybe earlier, in the form of credit cards. And when they built this thing, I just felt that there was a whole mess of misaligned incentives, which gave us the monster that we have now. But you're taking on a dangerous task, Matt, and when you're building a system that does mimic cash and does have properties like anonymity and privacy, especially in a country like the US. So I applaud you for that.
It's true. That's true. Yeah, it's gotten a lot easier. That was always a concern of mine early on, but I guess seems like they've been taking a laissez-faire attitude more recently, so increasingly less worried.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of those things where, I mean, just like you are talking about, like we're just saying, like, what is Bitcoin and open source and this like intrinsic value of money? It kind of brings like this duty in this world government of like, look, this thing's very important. It's important that this thing not be manipulated and not go in that direction. And, I'm with you, Matt, like things have kind of lightened up on that end, because I was worried getting into, like, it's one of those things where it's like, what am I doing here? Is this okay to be doing? But things have changed, and August 1st is coming up. That's an anniversary of UASF and that coming together. And on that same day, I don't know what's going on, but they're talking about pushing legislation to allow these 3D printed guns and all these different things to where, I don't know, the independent individual that might come back one day. Like this whole worry of 84, it's there, but we got some positive stars out there that might shoot our way. So we'll see how it goes.
We are very lucky to live in a country that still has a Supreme Court that protects source code as free speech.
Yeah, maybe it's just a calm before the storm.
It's up in the air.
I guess we'll have to see. But I think we're coming up to the end of your lunch break, though, Matt. So I'd just really like to thank you for coming on and talking with all this about us. It's been a real fun time.
Yeah, thanks, guys, for having me.
And Chris, it was wonderful to see your beautiful face again. So how would you like to give us your typical exit spiel for us today?
Well, I would just say to you that you can like and subscribe, but only if you want to.
Toodaloo, everybody. We'll
Later,
see you on Sunday.